Start up. Okay, there we go. So I did think we should start with the Greek versus Judeo-Christian understandings. I
Okay.
think that's a good kind of way to, let me turn my cell phone off just in case no one should call at this time. But I just think that's kind of a good way to place people who don't have a philosophy background into the issues that we are.
I have to try to rethink it, because how we get into it is sort of what is existentialism, because they came to take that course, but that's not going to make sense as a way to get into it here. I guess, how about there's something unique about our culture, which as far as I know, no other culture has. We have a total split in our understanding of what it is to be a human being and what it is to be a world. And we inherit one tradition from the Greeks and an entirely different, utterly opposed understanding from the Judeo-Christian. And if you couldn't live by both of them, because they deeply contradict each other. So, for instance, in their view about what knowledge is, Plato discovered theory, and theory, which he discovered because the mathematicians had theory and there were physicists of sorts who had theory, but he really thought the doctors were the best. They had an understanding of the body and nutrition and so forth based on their science. But whatever, theory was always, Plato thought, discovery of sort of universal structures of the world or of the body, and that when you got theory right, it was true for everybody for all time, whatever you learned about whatever subject you had. And knowledge for Plato, that was real knowledge, when you had some truths that you could count on any rational being recognizing as true. And now, in the other tradition, what counted as knowledge and truth was totally different. The Hebrews didn't think that any important truths were available to everybody, everywhere. They thought that there was a truth for them, that God had made a covenant with them, and instead of thinking of truth as corresponding, as theories corresponding to reality, they thought of being true too. So they were being true to their God, and truth amounted to the most individual sort of thing that the Hebrew tribe had and nobody else had. And whereas Plato thought that you got at truth by becoming completely detached from your body, your tradition, your personal interests, so that you, by becoming utterly indifferent, discovered the truths that everybody who became detached from their body and their tradition and their skills and their perspective would discover the same ones. The Hebrews thought the way you got at truth was by total involvement and total commitment. So you get being true to the God was just the opposite of becoming detached from your tradition and your skills and your emotions. It was sort of putting them all in that, focused on that. And so that's one of the big oppositions. Are you going to seek truth by being detached and seek universal truth? Or are you going to seek truth by being utterly involved and seek a local truth for a particular people? Now, that's one of the big oppositions. Another big opposition is in ethics. It's even more striking. So Plato, still thinking in terms of theory, thought that in ethics you had to find out what the essential character of human beings was, what every human being needed, and then figure out how to get that. So he had a theory of the soul as having three parts. It isn't important what his theory was. The important thing was that he thought you could discover ethical principles about how to live because you could discover the essential structure of human beings, and on the basis of that find out universal, abstract truths, principles to live by for all human beings. Now, it's just the opposite with the Hebrews. They thought that there was, that God told you what was the right thing to do, and that could be different for each individual, and it depended on the specific situation of the specific individual and their specific relation to God. So Kierkegaard made that the most important focus by going into the Abraham story and saying, look, Abraham was told that by God to kill his son, but you can't expect to have a universal principle that every father who's a good Hebrew should kill, or every father in general, it would have to be in Plato, should for some reason or other kill his son. It makes no sense at all. So for them, the Hebrews, the ethical was tied up with being the particular individual you were, in the particular situation you were, doing the thing that you felt absolutely called to do by your identity in your situation, so that only Abraham, in his situation, was called to kill Isaac. And so now you can see this really striking difference if you go back to Plato and remember that if you read the Euthyphro, where Socrates finds a guy who is about to turn in his father for killing a slave, and Socrates wants to know whether that's really the right thing to do. And never mind the details, he's trying to find the universal principles about it. But he asks Euthyphro an important question. Is an action good because the gods love it, or do they love it because it's good? And Euthyphro says, without any doubt, that an action is good because if an action is good, the gods love it. And that means there's some independent way of deciding what's the right thing to do, and even the gods will be subject to that rationality. It's because it's universal. And so if it's good, the gods love it because it's good, to talk like Plato. Now, you can see where you get with the Hebrews. If you ask Abraham, is an action good because God loves it, or does God love it because it's good? You get just the opposite. Because obviously Abraham killing Isaac isn't a universal good which even God would have to recognize. It only becomes good because God demands it of Abraham. So there you get that the ethics for Plato is universal and rational, and ethics for the Hebrews is completely individual and tied up with having an individual identity and an individual commitment. And again, total opposition. You're looking worried.
No, well, it's not. I mean, obviously, the Hebrews have the Ten Commandments, or they had certain rules that just seems like there could be exceptions, but they still seem to live most of the time by rules. And you can imagine, like a Hebrew doctor probably had theories about the body, and I don't see.
I see. Good.
Not coexist very.
Okay. Well, I think maybe if you ask yourself, but what's important? I mean, it's obvious that God's particular relation with Abraham trumps the Ten Commandments, which say, "Thou shalt not kill." And then, otherwise, when you're not being commanded to do anything specific by your own identity and your unique situation, there will be general principles, and there'll be right to follow them. But as Kierkegaard puts it, Abraham is the most important. He's the father of the faith. And the question is whether the father of the faith will obey the Ten Commandments or obey God, and they're in opposition, and then you choose God. Whereas in Plato, the wisest person, if there's an opposition between what his identity requires and what ethics requires, has to choose the universal, has to do what every rational man would do.
That makes sense. It's good when you look this way, actually, because you catch a little bit more of the light. So if you thoughtfully look over here, that's good.
That's good. Okay, I'll think over there.
And what's also nice is when you lift up your hand a couple of times,
Right.
it fills up the other half of the frame over here.
Ah.
I don't know if you it seems
Okay,
natural ever.
yeah,
but,
I can do that.
you know,
That's
just
good. Okay.
Little tiny details.
Okay, that's good.
So now we're going to talk about metaphysics, or
That's right. So finally, the third way that these hard things get sorted out in totally opposite ways is metaphysics, where metaphysics means what ultimate reality is. Of course, by the way, the Hebrews don't even have the categories ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology, which is the name for this issue about knowledge, because they are not doing that reflective sort of thing that Plato's doing, or the Greeks are doing. But let's suppose they had metaphysics. So what is ultimate reality for Plato? Ultimate reality is what theory shows. And whatever theory shows, it's always got to do not only with what's universal, so for everybody, but true for all time. Everything important is atemporal. That is, the laws of science are atemporal. They apply to the beginning, from the beginning to the end of history. And the laws of and the ethical principles are atemporal. And so what's ultimately real and most important is this non-temporal world, so to speak, and nothing important happens in time for the Greeks. Even the universe has always been here, recycling eternally, and the truths of math and the truths of physics and the truths of medicine and the truths of ethics have always been true for all times. Now, of course, the Hebrews look entirely different. Everything important happens in time. The only thing that's ultimately real is time. In time, the universe gets created at a certain, you can't say at a certain moment of time, but there was a before the universe was there. It's hard to know how to put this, but obviously there's somehow beginning of the universe, and moreover, everything important happened then Abraham came along and smashed all the idols, and that was a temporal big deal event. And then Moses came along later and got the 10 Commandments, and that was a big deal temporal event. And finally, the most amazing event of all, God became man at a certain moment in time, at a certain place, for a certain people, and that was the Jesus as God-man. That tradition, as St. Paul said, is a scandal to the Greeks. I mean, the gods of all things ought to be eternal and ought to be outside of time and outside of particular places and not bound up with particular people. So you get one metaphysics which says what's ultimately real is that is whatever is universal and eternal, and the other one that says what's ultimately real is temporal and finite and local, and that's another huge opposition. So, and we live in this amazingly schizophrenic, I used to say schizophrenic, but the students thought at some point that was not a good way to call it. Divided is too weak. I don't know, opposed in some very, very deep way tradition in which we believe incompatible things, where I've just listed the incompatible things, but you can see how it works itself out in our life. So, for instance, it's clearest in ethics. On the one hand, we feel that we ought to do whatever is the universal thing to do. We ought to, because it's whatever's right is right for everybody. But at the same time we're doing that, we're feeling that we're just being conformists. And what we ought to do is really our own unique, important thing that follows from our commitment and our mission and so forth. And then, but of course, if we do that, from the ethical point of view, we're just deviating into craziness and subjectivity. So you don't know which to do or which to admire. Somebody who's going against the ethical in the name of some higher calling, or somebody who is sacrificing all their individual commitments and needs to the universal principles in order to do what's right. And there's no way to reconcile that. And so we're just caught in that. And you want to say something? You look like you do.
I do. I want to